Alright, so for this exercise, we're going to be looking at just the basics. And again, if you have any questions, like as I'm speaking, or you think I'm going too fast or too slow, or you want me to elaborate on like a studio feature a little bit, then feel free to interrupt me or just stop me whenever I'm speaking. Right. So the comments below are mostly, in each exercise, are mostly for me, and that's kind of like to help me with the structure of what I want to go through. But it might also help you as like a guide of the topics and the features that we're gonna walk through. So let's start. Let's start with creating a background layer. So in the projects, I've already included a background layer here. You see it's just stored in a variable here called BG. I usually just do it because it's shorthand for background. And usually the first property that you want to use with the background layer is to set the color. Now you can also use it to create a gradient, a linear gradient, and the color here can be like any hex string, or it can be an RGB string as well. So here you see I create a RGBA string. Let's create a black background color with transparency as well. And the properties of a background layer is that it always fills the entire canvas, no matter where it's displayed. So, and you'll notice here that it's the first property is being indented here. So with CoffeeScript, it's quite flexible how you can define properties with layers. So for instance, I could put it here as well, as long as there's a space between like the initialization, so the new background layer, or I could indent it here or here. It's really a personal preference of how you prefer to write your code. So in this case, if I would want to do more properties, I could write it below here. So I could write opacity. I could also comma separate them. I could also do it all on one line here and comma separate them. It's really a personal preference. But recently we find that most people prefer this notation, where it's kind of everything's indented. There's no comma separation, and it's all just stacked below, so it's kind of easy for you to view. So with the background set up here, which is our signature framework color code here, that you'll probably see in many more examples, let's create a new layer. So it may be already present in the comments there, so I usually call them layer A if we want to create multiple layer. So this is just a variable again. We can choose any name here we want, and then new layer. You see by default, we've included some properties that are inserted or like created with every layer that you create. So this is just to visualize that the layer is actually being created. So we give it a semi-transparent blue background by default. We set the X and Y to 0 and the width and height to 100 pixels. Now you can probably better see it if I comment out the background layer here. So this is how it looks like if you just create one single new layer.
Can you tell the shortcut of how you make things in common?
Oh yeah, sorry, that is command slash. So command slash here. Command plus slash.
Can everyone read that writing? Is it a bit small?
Oh yeah, I could increase the font size.
Make it really big because I'm reading mine.
Yeah, that's better. Okay. So let's put back the background layer here. Now, this is kind of tricky to see. So the first thing we want to do here is also create a background color and just set it to white. You could also just use the CSS string. Now you'll see that it'll just overwrite the default property of the background color. And we could, to position it, we could define X and Y values ourselves, so hard code them. So for instance, we could say X of 100 and Y of 100. But what you'll likely just find is that you want to flexibly center things depending on their super or sub layer or whatever context they're in. And so we created a bunch of very nifty functions for that. So what you could write is just, we could call the layer, and we could then call the center function, which will automatically center your layer in whatever view it's in. So this is also depending on like the hierarchy of a layer. So it is in Framer, parent and child layers are called super layers and sub layers respectively. So in this case, since the layer is not contained within any other super layer, it will just get centered specifically in the entire window. So it'll just look at whatever my window size is. So you can see here in the preview pane, if I would resize it and refresh, it would then update the position here. Now what's cool is that it's dynamically centered now, right? But you can still retrieve whatever the current position is of a layer. So we're going to make a draggable layer later, but I can already show you that if you do the print function, which allows you to like visualize values within Framer, you can say print layer a dot x. You can retrieve over here whatever its current x position is. So the horizontal distance here is exactly 429 pixels. And you can basically print anything. So I can comma separate it and say, hey, also print the y position here. And you'll see that these values are still available for me to design with.
Do I have to click something for that console to come up?
No, you simply have to type print and then whatever you want to print. So I can also, it's basically, if you're familiar with working with JavaScript, another way to work with console.log, except we surface it right here within the app. So you can just print any string as well. So if I were to say hello here,
So you're indenting things at different levels. What is the indentation? So background color is indented.
right.
And
So,
layer A is
sorry, what is it?
indented.
Yeah. So now both properties, both background color properties are indented, but it's CoffeeScript really allows you to really flexibly write down properties. So you could also just write it like this, and it may be good to know that this is essentially what CoffeeScript does. Is if you're familiar with JavaScript already, is create an object here. So the great thing about CoffeeScript is that it's really flexible. So parentheses and closing tags are not necessary to include, but it may be helpful if you don't understand the concept. So we're allowed to do this because in the backend, what is converted to is like the proper object notation that's also in JavaScript. So you'll see here that this is essentially what it's doing for you if you were to write JavaScript. And if we were then to include another property, but since CoffeeScript is so flexible, we need not include these here. So it's a function call, and then parentheses, the properties are stored within an object. But within Framer and CoffeeScript, it's really flexible, so we can just write it like this. We can choose to comma separate it, but it really doesn't matter. So we chose CoffeeScript because it's really like a flexible way for you to write things, and it's really forgiving, and we think it will help people to quickly or faster pick up the concepts if you're not familiar with JavaScript. So let's continue here. I'm going to add a little bit of a border radius property to the layer to round the corners here. And this can be, this is a numeric property, but it can still also be a string. So you can do 50%, for instance, to create like a circle. Or you can create a really large use a really large numeric value to also create a circle here. And the nice thing about using numeric values here to round the corners is that they can be animated. So you could, and I'll show you this later, we can create animations that range from circles to squares again. So let's remove the print statement here. So let's try to create a draggable layer now. Enabling dragging is really simple. So it's just one line. So we reference the layer again. And layer a dot, and then we write draggable dot enabled is true. So it's a boolean here. Now boolean values have two values, so it can be either true or false. And so by default dragging is not enabled. But what you'll see now is that by default, draggable layers include momentum, so you can just pick it up and toss it around, and it will automatically calculate the velocity here of your dragging speed, which is pretty cool. You can even toss it all the way off screen if you toss it really fast. If you toss the layer off screen, you can simply hit Command R to refresh your window, and it'll pop right back in the center. Now you might feel that here the layer is a little too small, so you can always just go back here, add another line. Let's put it after border radius and just increase the size. So let's say the width to 200 and the height to 200, and it'll just, again, it will, because the center function is still positioned there, it will just stay centered. Now another way to increase the size would be by using the scale property. So instead of defining the width and height, we could say scale to 2, which would effectively produce the same thing. And another very nifty shortcut that you'll probably see later in exercises as well is that the width and the height properties together are also a thing, and we call them size. So if you're working with Framer for a while, you may get tired of defining width and height explicitly. So what you could also write in this case is simply say size is 200, and it will define the width and the height respectively. Now, another thing here is that the layer now can be tossed off screen, right? So another thing that the width and the height and the X and the Y position is together is a frame. So a layer's frame can be printed, for instance, here. We could say print the layer A.frame. You'll see that it will return an object here that contains the X position, the Y position, the width, and the height. So these things together are called a frame. Now, specifically when working with draggable layers, these are really useful because most often you do not want to be able for a layer to be tossed off screen, right? So what we can do, you can define constraints. So a very nifty way of visualizing how constraints work is by simply using a layers frame. So before we set the constraints explicitly, let's just start by creating a layer here. So we can call it constraints, and it'll just be a regular layer. So I'll just disable the printing here for now. So let's create a few basic properties to properly visualize it. So I'm going to say I want it to be a little bit bigger here. So the width and height is 300. I think a proper visualization would be with a semi-transparent white background. So I'm just going to include an RGBA string here with 255, 255, and then maybe, I don't know, 0.5 here. And then I also want to center the constraints here. So I just copy this line, copy the variable, and now it will place the constraints layer exactly on top of the draggable layer by default. So I'm going to add a little bit of a border radius because it looks nice. Increase this here. So now nothing is being set yet, right? This actually effectively does nothing yet. But what we've done is we've created a layer constraint that we can now use actually define the draggable constraints. So like I said here, a frame of a layer contains the X position, the Y position, the width, and the height of a layer. So what you can do explicitly if you want to define constraints is you can say, hey, layer A.draggable.constraints and then it takes the object. So it takes a frame. So this is a really nifty trick of working with other layers. And even if you're working with imported content and you want to say, hey, I want the layer to be draggable within this range, instead of explicitly defining it, you could even reference imported layer frames. So in this case, what we want to do is say constraints.frame. Now you'll see that we've explicitly defined the constraints to take the frame here, and that it cannot be it can be dragged beyond the constraints, but it will always snap back now. And so it essentially lives within the bounds of this layer. Now, there's really no other reason for this to be visual, except for that it's easy to understand. But in most cases, you'll probably want the constraints to be hidden. But you'll see if we hide the background color here, it can still only snap beyond the constraints here. Now, if you're a little bit confused about this, it may help to print it out. So if we print the constraints.frame, you'll see exactly what is happening. So they're all being centered within this window, right? So there's a set vertical or horizontal distance here and a vertical distance there. And to better understand how dragging constraints work, what you can actually do is grab these values here, and you can see that you can set them explicitly as well. So let's say we don't want to do this, and we want to explicitly set the values here. You can say, hey, this is what I want the draggable constraints to be. So I want the x, maybe it's better to indent this. I want the x to be here, the y distance to be this, the width to be this, and the height to be this. And you'll see that this is effectively exactly the same thing, because we're simply printing out the values here. And you'll also see that this layer is not at all necessary anymore now.
So we can use a different name for the constraints layer, right? Because now it's a bit confusing. Whereas when it gets blue, it's like the framework's parameters. But so we can rename the layer constraints.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, the constraints layer is just used as a regular layer, so it can be anything. So it can be layer B. It's just a variable. So we only created the layer to grab these values here and to visualize like what the constraints are in this case. But the only thing that's required here is that we grab the x, y, and width and height values of anything. But you'll find that especially if you're working with Sketch or Photoshop and you're going back and forth, it's really nifty to say, hey, I have this scroll view designed, and I want the constraints to be this layer, and you can just grab the frame directly without even knowing what the values are. Okay, so in general, I should mention that in the previous version here, effectively the constraints layer gets placed on top of our layer. So it will be considered better practice if you're actually working on a prototype to first design a constraints layer. Or if you're working with importing, you're probably referencing it from your Sketch or Photoshop file. But in this case, I should probably move it here. And it doesn't get placed on top of our layer here, which effectively doesn't matter here because it's transparent, but it's still probably considered better practice. So next, it's probably fun to look at a couple of dragging events and to play around with that for a little bit. So we can simply say, hey, layer A dot on. This is how you start referencing events. So whenever layer A dot events dot drag start. So let's just start with a print statement here. So what this effectively does is it's a function, right? And it listens to an event. So now we reference an event listener. If you're familiar with JavaScript but not with CoffeeScript, this may look weird to you, but in this case, the arrow is always signifying a function call. So we're now calling the function with the on keyword, and in this case, we're listening to an event here, which with the comma separation and then the function call. Now, you could also include arguments within your function, and then you will be able to write that here, like this. But let's not do that right now. So now you'll see that whenever I start dragging the layer, it will print hello one time. And it will do it for every time I start dragging the layer whenever I released it. And so this, of course, means that we can do a lot of cool things here. So if we decrease the size again, let's say 150, we can say, okay, whenever we start picking up the layer, we want it to kind of scale up a tiny little bit. So we can include an animation here. So we can say, okay, whenever we start dragging the layer, we animate the layer, and we choose which properties we want to animate. So let's just do scale to, I don't know, 1.2. And let's also include a little bouncy curve. So, and note the indentation here. So I'll speak a little bit more about different ways that you can write this animation. But in general, it's helpful to understand that animate is a function. Within properties, we essentially store objects. So properties, every property here is an object that you can either choose to indent, to write below each other, or to comma separate, just like layer properties here. For the sake of the example, I'm going to try to indent them all and place them below each other because I think it's a little more legible. But that's the reason why curve, because curve here will not be a property, is indented at the same level as the properties declaration within my animate function. So the indentation here is important. So to define a spring curve, we can include it in a string here. And spring curves take actually four values, but let's talk about three first. Tension, friction, and velocity. Now these are really cool. So this is kind of one that I use in default here. So the last one here is velocity. You can think that if you consider like a catapult, that's kind of like the wind up. So the 0 here, I put it to 0 because if you put in a lot of velocity, it will start really quickly, right? So consider a catapult now and think of velocity. So the 0 here as the wind up. So the 400 is the tension. So if you consider like a ball that is being catapulted into the air, it's kind of the weight that eventually is pulling it down again. So it's like the physics, right? So it's eventually being pulled down, so that's the tension. And in the middle here, this can be like from 1 to 1,000 usually. And the friction here is basically defining the bounciness. So consider the ball going down again, and how bouncy should it be whenever it hits the ground? So a thing we notice that often produces pretty or spring curves that feel nice is whenever you have a value here within the 100 that's divided by 10 here. So if these ranges are sort of similar, so think 440, 550, that usually produces quite nice curves. So let's just try this out now. You'll see that whenever we start dragging, and we can refresh again to see it, it will bounce a little bit and it will scale up. So in this case, we can decrease the friction here to make it even more bouncy. And to make it a little more dramatic, let's do 410. And you'll see that it's super bouncy. Now, a thing you'll notice here is that we animate the layer to scale. Oh, sorry.
I saw a few confusions about the arrow, how you write that down.
Oh. What's the type? Oh, yeah, so the arrow consists here. It's just a little dash and then the shift right arrow key. So it's basically two characters. So yeah, so here, let me zoom in a little bit. It's just a dash first and then right arrow. So
it's and the reason why you write down it's a function which is being called, like when the event drag starts, the code which indented will be called. That's why you write down the arrow.
So for those of you who are familiar with JavaScript, this is a fantastic website and resource to help you understand what is happening between CoffeeScript and JavaScript. So you've probably seen JavaScript code before. And in this case, you can see that what is effectively happening in JavaScript here and how it translates to CoffeeScript. So it's pretty visible here that the parentheses are all gone. There's just indentation. And you can see here the arrows as well within the function call. In this case, the function is an expression in CoffeeScript, so it's being given a name, and these are the function arguments or the parameters. So this is a pretty cool resource if you're working with JavaScript and you want to, at any time, want to convert code on the fly. So this gets updated automatically, as you'll see here. It's just live conversion, so it's a really nifty tool if you're familiar with it. Okay, so what you'll notice now, though, in this interaction is that it bounces up and it scales, but it will now, when I continue dragging, it is already being set to the scale property to 1.2. So it will stay at 1.2 now. If I continue dragging, nothing will happen again at each drag start. So each time now, the drag start event gets called, but there's nothing to animate anymore. So what we can do now is we can add another event that says, hey, listen to whenever we stop dragging and then scale back the layer. So that's pretty fun to do, so let's try that out. An easy way to do this is to just copy the entire block of code here, paste it, and replace drag start with drag end. And then scale it down to 1 again with exactly the same curve. So now, if you look at the screen, you'll see we start dragging, it bounces up. I can move it around. If I release it, it will bounce right back to its original size.
When you pasted on the line below, did you press Shift Enter? Because when I press Enter, it always goes in line with the latest
right, yeah.
notation.
I just pressed Enter twice. So if I'm right here, I do Enter. Oh, and then backspace. Sorry, yeah. Yeah. Enter and then backspace to return to your indentation. Yeah. It may be good to visualize that as well. So that's another shortcut that's pretty cool in Framework Studio. If you want to visualize the indentation, it's a shortcut called Show Invisibles. So it's available here as well. Show Invisibles from the menu. And you can see the shortcut as well. So it's Control Command I. So if you can, and then if you type that, you toggle between showing invisibles. So spaces, indentations, tabs, and enters are all being visualized now. So it may be helpful for me to turn that on now. Now, this is a pretty cool effect, but there's, I think it's fun to talk a little bit about how we've written this down and to help you better understand that there's a ton of ways that we could now do this. So, for instance, like I said, whatever the properties are here is stored within an object. So now we only animate the skill, and so there's nothing to comma separate, but this is effectively, again, the same as writing this. So this works just the same. And what I usually do is I do wrap this in parentheses because it helps me to understand that these properties here are being stored in an object. And in this case, you can see that everything that I'm referencing within the animate function here is at the same indentation, which I personally think is nice. And if we now want to include another property, so let's say rotation, we simply comma separate it. And now we'll also rotate, so let's make it a little less bouncy here. So I think to realize here is that when it comes to coding, everyone has an opinion about it, and everyone has a personal preference of how to format it, like how to write things down, the syntax. So it's really, there's no real right or wrong way to do it. I mean, there is obviously a wrong way to do it if you forget your indentation. But in general, CoffeeScript is so flexible that it really comes down to what you prefer. So above what you see is my personal preference, but again, the parentheses here are optional. I could even comma separate them on the next line here, as long as they're indented. So once you get like a feel of what CoffeeScript can and can't do, it's actually quite straightforward. So there's a couple of rules around spacing and indentation, but very quickly you'll pick them up and you'll notice that, hey, it's actually really flexible. And a really fun thing to do is when you're prototyping and you're almost finished with whatever interaction you're designing, is just to go back and look at your code. I think this is really fun to do and to see like, hey, can I clean things up? Can I do some nifty one-liners here? Is there any way for me to reduce the amount of lines of my code? And just exactly for presentations or examples on the website, I always try to do this. Like, can I make it more clean? Is it like legible enough? So let's just create here the same spring curve. So you'll notice there's quite a bit of repetition here. So in this case, we use the same spring curve in both events. So using the power of scripting, we can also store anything in a variable, right? So let's say we have a really complex prototype. You don't want to be able to, let's say you have multiple elements that you want to animate with the same curve. So maybe you have 5 different spring curves or easing transitions that you're using throughout on multiple elements and multiple layers. Now, it can get really hard to maintain if you have to shift through all your code and you want to edit each value that is corresponding, but you want to tweak them a little bit. So what we can also do now here is we can simply store the exact string here in a variable. So let's call this one bouncy curve, and we can just store it here. And then instead of explicitly defining them in the curve declaration here, we can simply reference the variable name. And so what you see now is that for us, if you imagine that we're using this spring curve in 6 or 8 elements, it's really easy for us to tweak the animation. You can simply change the value here. And you see now that since we applied a lot of friction, it's really slow. And we can also add another property here. So let's scale it back to 0. I'm just going to indent them all now. And this is just a really nice way to set up your document. So what you often see people doing if you're looking at online examples is they start their prototype with a bunch of variables that they simply comment out, hey, these are my variables. And they eventually become like parameters that you can tweak. So that's a common practice for you to just create a section here that's like, hey, variables. I'm just going to leave it here for now. And then you can just continue coding your prototype, and then whenever you want to go back and say, hey, this doesn't feel right, you can simply tweak one of these variables here. So it's fun to add back the add the rotation property on the drag end event as well. You see that whenever we release it, it will return to its original rotation here. Now the draggable layer is really, really powerful. So this barely touches like the surface of what you can do. So I want to kind of briefly highlight the a little more advanced stuff now. Like there's more dragging events than just drag move, drag start, and drag end. So for instance, as you can tell here, this is a different effect. So whenever we release the layer, there's something else occurring. So these are also available as multiple properties within Framer. So we have velocity, for instance, that is however fast we are tossing the layer around. This effect that we can drag beyond the constraints is called overdrag. So let me just, and again, it's nice to think of Safari in particular when browsing the web. And you're scrolling really fast and you reach the bottom of the page, right? You can see that it will extend a little bit beyond, and you see like the default background color of iOS, and then it snaps back. So that behavior, if you think of that, that's being called overdrag in Framer. So if we say layer a.draggable.overdrag, and this is a boolean, is false, you can see we can pick it up, but we cannot drag beyond the constraints anymore. We can still toss it around though. So just to better illustrate, I'm gonna decrease the size a little bit. You can see that if I pick it up, it cannot go beyond, and you see it goes beyond a tiny bit. That's just because of the scaling animation. So if we just remove the scale here, you see that it neatly sits within the constraints because we disabled overdragging. Now, and I'm gonna try to illustrate this. If I toss it around fast enough, it can still move beyond its constraints though. So this is overdrag because I'm picking up the layer and tossing it against its edges. But if I try to pick it up real quickly, I hope this works, you can see, I'm just going to disable rotation as well here. You can see that if I toss it quickly enough, it can still go beyond the constraints. No, that's not it. Yeah. So that's only if I release it before I reach the edge. So that is another property. Let's see. And that's called bounce. So it's also a Boolean. So if I disable bouncing, you'll see that no matter what I do, it can never now extend the constraints. So again, this is that's a very subtle difference, but over drag means I'm picking up the layer, and whenever I'm still dragging it and I'm hitting the edges, we cannot go beyond. And bounce is I'm picking it up and I'm tossing it, and before I'm releasing the layer, it still has some momentum. So it's still calculating the physics, and then it can calculate based on its velocity, so how fast it's going, it will bounce off the edges a little bit. So these are two different values, and you can see that whatever the physics of these are, you can also customize. So you can go really, really in depth and create really, really custom interactions here. And a final thing, so let me just comment these two out here. Another thing that's really cool with dragging is the momentum. So it's another Boolean here. So if you only disable momentum, you'll see that my layer cannot be tossed around anymore. See, if I pick it up within the constraints and I try to toss it, it'll just stay at the exact position that I left it at with the mouse. So these are three really, really powerful dragging properties that you can customize. Yeah, you can. I'll touch on it briefly, but the bounce. Sorry. Oh yeah, sorry. The question was if the values, so the animation that occurs whenever it's bouncing or the momentum, is customizable, and they all are. So you have another property. So instead of just enabling and disabling them, you can also work with the tension and the friction curves, which really, really allows for some super fine-grained control. So we have, for instance, a property called and this is an object, momentum options. Now these take a couple of values. So this is also, you can think back of the spring curve here, which had tension, friction, and velocity. And these are the same values that you can work with here. So let me just go to the framework source real quick to look up the defaults. So this is essentially a little more advanced, but these are the values that you can customize with momentum and the bounce options. So to go back to the spring curve, we can define it here within just a string, but that's essentially still the same as defining it as an object here. So it's just like a shorthand that we've created in Framer, but these are not separate things. So these are the same spring values that you're working with when animating with a spring curve in an animation or space declaration. So, but now it's fun to see. Okay, let's see if we change the friction here. And again, the bounce is whatever happens when we toss the layer and it goes beyond the edges. And the momentum option is just when we toss it around here. Now, it's fun to play around with momentum specifically, because if you increase the friction, you'll find that your draggable layer will start feeling really, really heavy. So you try to toss it around, but it quickly snaps back to its position. Now,
some pretty advanced stuff you mostly don't.
Yeah, if you really want to create your own custom animations, and it's a nice example though of how much you can control of your interactions. So if you're creating a custom view or a custom scroll view or paging animation, this is also all stuff that you can customize as well. So that's one of the advantages of working in code and in Framer, is that everything essentially is customizable and it's really flexible. But it's definitely fun to play around with though. And there's like a ton of draggable properties that you can print out to see what's happening behind the scenes, and values that you can design with. So we can say, for instance, if you want to say, we want to retrieve the velocity whenever we're tossing layers around, we can say, okay, we need to do this on a dragging move event. And you'll see that, and these are like values that you can also design with, that whenever we now move the layer, we can retrieve the velocity. So it's a number that represents the speed, not necessarily the distance, but really the speed, vertically and horizontally. And this allows for some really incredible things. So what you can do now is, besides, let's think of an example where we want to swipe left or right to delete an item. You can not only design like, hey, when it's past a certain distance, I want the item to be removed, right? So you can, that's also quite easy. You can just say, listen to the X values or the Y values. But you can now also test this on your phone, for instance, and design with the speed. So you're really flicking items. So you want to say, hey, it doesn't just matter how far I'm dragging this layer around, so how far I'm moving it, but if I'm moving it very little, but it has enough velocity, so the speed is quick enough, then we can also design with that and say, okay, if the velocity is larger than 2, for instance, which is a factor, that's the number, then remove the layer or do this. So it allows you to really work with distance and speed as well, so both really, or either or is possible. Another fun thing is, a fun distinction to understand is that drag move only fires whenever I'm actively dragging the layer. So I'm picking it up here and I'm moving it here. That is the drag move event. But after drag end, there is still, I could toss it around, right? So that is as momentum enabled. So, but there's still an animation occurring there. So these are also events that you can work with. So if you want to capture the entire movement of your draggable layer, or scrolling layer, or paging layer, which we'll look at later as well, then you can simply type move. So this is a unique event that is on every draggable layer, so also on your scroll component, or page component, and or slider component. And you see that whenever I stop dragging, it will continue, because it is a spring curve, it will just visualize, or it will continue running and printing the velocity even after I've tossed and released it. So to illustrate this again, let me pick it up here and toss it around. And you can see that it continues to calculate whatever the distance is, even after I've released the layer. So the move event is extremely powerful as well. And a very other specific thing. So move captures the entirety of the movement. But there's a couple of more, and this is also more advanced, but I think it's fun to highlight really briefly, is that we also have drag animation. Let me just type it out. Drag animation did start, for instance. So this is another very specific event that fires whenever I think again, I'm tossing a layer here, and after drag end, it calculates, okay, I have to continue moving now, because I'm physics-based, I have some momentum here. How far do I have to go? And whenever that moment occurs, this event fires. So it starts to animate beyond your control, right? You've already had your interaction, you've released it and tossed it. You'll see now that it doesn't fire, but as soon as I release it, it fires once. Whenever it starts to calculate the animation position. And again, we also have drag animation did end here. So this fires whenever the layer is completely, oh, that's a little bug here, completely finished animating. And you'll see, obviously, the velocity values here will be 0, because this event fires whenever the layer returns to its position and it stops moving, essentially.
Is that something you've played with, or can you give us an example when you actually use that in an app? Or is it
Good example might be the tilting of the layer while moving around.
Oh, the 3D effect.
That's
Yeah. We might touch upon it later, yeah. Yeah, I can't think of an example right now, but the drag animation events are definitely useful, especially when working with scrolling stuff. There's definitely instances where you want more fine-grained control over when it fires. So I think we may touch upon it in one of the scroll examples, yeah. So it's fun also to know that all the components are essentially also based on this draggable. So we've mapped a lot of the events, so you can use scrolling events, and you have specific page component events when working with pages. But essentially, behind the scenes, we're using these draggable layers. So you can use all of these properties, momentum, velocity, bounce, overdrag, as well when you're working with scrolling or paging components. So that's really nice. Yeah. That's nice, yeah. Sorry? Oh, yeah, so he said like a nice example of potentially using the drag animation did start and did end events would be with a pull to refresh interaction. So whenever you release the layer is when the animation did start could fire, and then the loading spinner would occur, and then when the loading is finished, you want the drag animation did end, and then the layer to move back to its original position. Yeah. So this was a nice intro of dragging, but I want to quickly touch on states as well. So you've seen here that there's in no place we've defined states. We've explicitly worked with calling unique animations here, but whatever we're doing here, we can also use with states, right? Because they're sets of properties. So I actually want to go back now and remove the dragging code here. So let's just only work with one layer here. So if you could all go back, let's make it a little larger. So we're back here with just 18 lines. So there's nothing draggable anymore, it's just a layer that's centered again. So let's try to add a couple of states now and toggle them on a click interaction. So let's just start with adding them. So to add states, we can type layer a.states.add. We indent. And now, first we can give it a name. So let's call this one scale, or let's say grow. Now grow has a set of properties. So we scale it. And let's animate the border radius to, let's make it a circle as well. So, or no, let's actually just rotate it again. So now we created one state. It's just as simple as this. We created a set of properties, given it a name. Let's add another one that's shrink. And I'm going to scale it to 1.5 by the way. And then we return the scale to 1. And then rotation to 0. And again, this is also a function calls and also objects containing properties. So the notation here is very flexible. We can comma separate them. We can one-line them if we would like to. But for the sake of legibility, I'm just going to leave it all indented and stacked below each other here. So nothing will happen now yet. We've simply defined sets of properties and we've stored them in variables for us to reference. But there's no event yet, there's no state switching occurring yet, so there's nothing yet that's noticeable here. What we could do, though, is trigger a state switch without an event as well, so just on initialization. Now, you can also obviously customize the animation that occurs here for the stage. You can define animation options for each state. But by default, we've included an animation curve. So by default, if you use any state switching functions, it will already animate. And that's also why we created a switch instant function that disables the animation. But let me just show you a default switch here. So it's also a function. Let's say grow. States.switch, sorry. Yeah. And you'll see that it very subtly, whenever you refresh the page, so Command R, sorry, it will switch to the grow animation. So it's effectively switching from the default state, which contains all the properties that we defined here. So rotation is being set to 0 by default, and it's being set to 1 by default as well, because we haven't overridden the default values here. And then we switch it to grow to 1.5 and 90 over here. So if we wanted to do this without an animation on initialization, we can say switch instant. So now whenever we load the page, it is switching to the grow state without any animation. So you won't see, and it's maybe better to visualize with a diagonal rotation here. You'll see that whenever we load, it instantly switches to this state now. Now, this is really cool, but this is still something that we define explicitly, right? So we have to know, okay, we've given names to our states. We have to know what is the name, and we want to switch to that state, which is something you often want to do. But in many cases, you'll just want to cycle between the states on click without having to explicitly define it. And that's something that's really cool with and possible with next. So I'm just going to, first, I'm going to say, create a click event. So I say, okay, whenever, I'm just going to comment the state switching out now on events.click. And this fires whenever we click the layer. So I'm just going to say, include a quick print statement, and you'll see that whenever we click the layer, this event will fire. Now, effectively, we have three states now. We have a default state, a grow, and a shrink state. So what we can do is we can cycle or toggle between each of them whenever we click them. So that's really cool, and it's just called layer without having to explicitly reference the name of the state. So I can say layer a.state.next, and what this will do is it will say, okay, whenever we click the layer, switch to whatever the next state is. So think of like an array where all your states are stored. So there's default, there's grow, and there's shrink. And whenever we click, it says, okay, go to the next one. Okay, go to the next one. And then whenever it's at the last of your states, it will go back to default. So it will infinitely allow you to toggle between states here. So to visualize, I can click once, I can click again. Now, there's a specific thing you'll notice here is that whenever I click from here, it effectively switches from shrink to default. But shrink and default effectively have no different properties, right? Because scale and rotation are set to 0 by default. So one way to better visualize this would be, okay, let's say by default I want to rotate my layer 45 degrees. So this is helpful in helping visualize the state toggling here. So now whenever we click, you see, okay, this is the grow state, this is the shrink state, and this is going back to default. So effectively all that occurs from shrink to default is rotation goes from 0 to 45 degrees. So when you can continually click, you'll see. And we can also print this out. So we can say, whenever we click, print the current state. So states.current, you'll see grow, shrink, default. And you'll see the name is literally just called default. Grow, shrink, default. So states are a super powerful way to really easily store chunks of properties and animations together and to toggle, to switch between them. We can even add, change, or remove states on click events. So I can say, hey, whenever we're at, I don't know, whenever we're at this page, I want the states to be different properties, so you can edit and alter them on the fly as well. So they're extremely powerful and flexible as well. Yes. So yeah, that's a good question. So if you don't want the default state to be included when toggling states, you can simply reference the layers within this function here. So I can reference the names that I've given my state. So I can say switch between grow and shrink. And you see that now it will still cycle between my states. And however many states I have explicitly defined there, it will cycle between. But it will now ignore the default state because I've specifically asked it to toggle between this and this state here. Now, we might not like the animation that occurs here. And to customize a state animation is a little different. We can simply reference it in a new line. And we can ask for the animation options. And this is, you should really think of this as the same sort of animation that we've previously defined. So we can say we want to define a time and a curve maybe. Ease in. So that is something that's possible. We can, again, you can also indent it like this. Maybe it's better to first define the time. And because this is an easing animation, we can set the time value here as being respected. So we can go really slowly, 2 seconds easing. And again, we can also, and this is obviously the most fun part, also just include a spring animation here. So notice how I'm removing the time declaration here because it makes no difference. And now we can play here with the tension, friction, and velocity again to create really snappy or bouncy animations, however you like.
Is there a way to specify a specific curve for each state?
Yeah, so if you previously here I was printing out, you can still see it in the console, I was printing out the state names. So what we can do is we can add conditional statements to our click event to say whenever we're at this state, use these animation options, or whenever we're at this state, use these animation options. So if you have 5 states, you can say, I want this to be east, I want this to be spring, I want this to be whatever you want, like repeat, delays, timing, it's all customizable. So I could show you really quickly. But it's also something we're probably covering in later workshop, but you can do this with conditional statements. So for instance, I could say if layer.states.current is grow, layer A dot states dot animation options is. This is essentially the beginnings of how you would set that up. So let me just say print current state is grow here. And you see this only fires when it's grow. So now it's shrink, now it's grow, now it's going back to shrink, now it's grow again. So this allows us to, you see it's bouncy and it eases. It's bouncy and it eases. And if we want to reset it, we have to expand this conditional statement. And you might also notice a couple of CoffeeScript things here. So this is effectively the same as a strict quality operator. So the cool thing about CoffeeScript is it allows you to use words instead of symbols to define your code. So in this case, we could also do this. But it's I think it's really nice and really easy for others to scan your code if you use the words. So there's a ton of words you can use: if, else, then, by. These are all words that are eventually converted to JavaScript symbols or operators. So in this case, we probably, let me just put it on one line here. In this case, we want to say now whenever it's grow, we want the ease. Otherwise, we want it to be this again. And we could simplify this by using variables again, or we could do it on one line. There's like a ton of options here. But you'll see now that it will snap bouncy, very bouncy here. Let me just add a longer time so it's more dramatic. And it very slowly snaps back. Now we can be more explicit, so we could say, okay, else if In this case, it's not necessary, right? Because we have 2 states, but you could, if you have a lot of states, you can do if states is this, or if it is shrink, and then another else statement. You could keep expanding this to how many ever states you like. But since we're only using 2 states, in this case, it's sufficient to use if else. So else will always trigger on shrink, and if states the first conditional statement will only trigger when grow is the current state. So again, slowly and very bouncy.
Is this going too quick for anyone?
So again, it's maybe fun to show that to clean up this code here a little bit, because they're pretty long lines. We could store all our different animations in variables as well. So we have nm1 and nm2, which contain different properties. So because this contains, these contain an easing curve and time, and this is just a spring curve. And we can then reference the variable names here and here. And one thing I really like, and this is going to be tricky because the specific declarations here are long, but you can do this entire thing in one line. So we can do if layer states that grow is grow, then do this. And then we can even string the else statement here, else this. Let me just zoom out to have it. But you can see you can create really cool one-liners here and customize your code by just putting it all in one line. So in this case, the then keyword represents your indentation. So you only want to use then if you're using it on one line. So if condition A, then do this, else do this. But if you don't want to use it on one line, you can say if condition, and then you do a new tab, and then you indent it, then the code that will run, and then use the else statement on the same indentation level next to it. But this is just a cool thing. I think it's really fun, and if you're working with more complex prototypes, you'll probably want to come across a couple of situations where it's cleaner for you to just put it all in one line. But in this specific case, it's I think it's more legible to form it like this.
Should we take a little break?
Yeah, that's cool.
Toilet break and food break and drink break.
Nice.